Let's go. Well, g'day everyone and welcome to week 14 on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. Of course, week 14 out of 44 weeks means we are officially 1/3 of the way through our challenge, so congratulations. And of course, that also means we're 1/3 of the way through the Bible, so well done. We are well and truly into the story, and as they say, the best is yet to come. Well, of course, if you're watching these videos live and you're an Aussie like me, it's also election morning, federal election here this weekend in Australia, so make sure you get out to vote. Now, speaking of politics, last week as we closed out the book of, how's that for a segue? Last week as we closed out the book of 1 Samuel, we witnessed not only a stark contrast between two main characters, King Saul and David, but with that character contrast, we're witnessing the very slow rise of David emerging from an anointed shepherd boy that the prophet Samuel prophesies over, one of the sons of Jesse, okay, from a shepherd boy to a servant of Saul, one of his instrument players, to the defeater of Goliath, a commander of Saul's army, and eventually a commander of his own army as he finds himself running away from King Saul, and men are gathered to him in the caves of Adullam and Ziklag and other kind of places, right? And so while David is rising in his prominence and in his leadership, we're also at the same time, or last week certainly, witnessed this gradual demise and ultimately the death of King Saul, and with him his son Jonathan, who of course would be his natural successor to the throne, okay? When King Saul dies, that's the idea about having a monarchy, right? When the king dies, the son naturally succeeds him. Well, Jonathan died there on the battlefield, and of course, there was really nothing that natural about that. What appears to be a whole bunch of natural political events, actually God's hand, supernatural hand, is well and truly behind these dealings, as God is effectively effecting the transfer of a kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, from Saul to young David, okay? From Saul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin, David, who's from the tribe of Judah, as foretold by Samuel the prophet, and as foretold maybe a little bit more subtle way in the book of Judges and Ruth previously read, okay? But as we saw over and over again, while David was emerging as the next leader, he was very set and certain on keeping his hands clean in the process. Okay, this transfer would be God's doing. Okay, the coming down of King Saul and the rising up of David is in God's hands, and David was very, very sure, time after time, that as much as he had opportunity to hurt Saul or to expose his father's nakedness, as it were, like the sons did with Noah, if you remember that story in the book of Genesis, David's conscience and David's reputation was too valuable for him, and he made sure, now I'm keeping my hands clean. If Saul's going to come down, it's going to be God's doing. And God even provided him this funny little test, as we saw last week, with a man called Nabal. In between the two instances where David could have killed Saul, you know, the tent issue where he cut off the hem of his robe, and then the spear by his head issue in the tent. In between these two stories, this amazing story of Nabal, that David had opportunity to take vengeance on, but he was saved from doing that by Abigail, if you remember that story. And again, this was just a warning to David and a sign to David. No. Keep your hands clean of blood, okay? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Keep this transition into God's hands, all right? So that's very much what happened last week. Well, this week, having lamented King Saul's death, we now see two men anointed as king in his place. Two men anointed as king. That's not the way it's supposed to happen, but here we have politics kicking in, all right? Basically, the commander of Saul's army, who's been loyal to Saul and still is loyal to Saul, even though he's dead, of course, takes Saul's fourth son, his youngest son, Ish-Bosheth, and he anoints him as king over Israel. Whereas at the same time, the followers of David go, no. God is on David's life, okay? God is on David's life. He's the one that's supposed to be king. And so at least in the tribe of Judah, David is recognized as king there, okay, based on Samuel's prophecy. So we effectively have two anointed kings for one kingdom. How's that going to work out? Well, not particularly well. And so it is here that another rivalry begins. What we've just seen between two men, David and Saul, we now see between their two followers, groups of followers, okay? The house of Saul and the house of David, or those loyal to Saul, loyal to the old, and those who are loyal to David because they know that this is where God is leading and this is what God is doing, okay? So basically what we see in this part of the Bible story that we're following this week is that David is recognized as king, but only amongst his own tribe. Only one of the 13 tribes of Israel, okay, or one of the tribal lands, recognize David as king, while the rest of Israel don't. And that period of time lasts for about 7 years, okay? And in the meantime, those other Israelite tribes are basically loyal to King Saul and what used to be. And so this transition is a little bit messy, and that's what takes place. And a lot of what happens in this part of history is summed up for us this week in 2 Samuel chapter 3. You'll be reading this yourself. Verse 1 simply says this: the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Okay, so a nice little summary there as to what's happening in this period of history. And there you go. That's pretty well the extent of the narrative this week. Our readings basically consist of three components. Firstly, we're going to read 3 chapters in 2 Samuel, chapters 2, 3, and 4, which is pretty straightforward, basically what I just described then, as we see the accounts of David and Ish-Bosheth both being anointed as king. The second part of the portions we're going to read is the first 10 chapters of Chronicles. Okay, now don't worry, 9 of them are genealogies. It's a bit boring, okay, and I imagine some of you are going to skim through them fairly quickly. Don't at all say that I encourage you to do that, but we're going to be starting reading Chronicles, and then of course we're hitting into the Psalms again, reading 25 Psalms this week. And as I said last week, this is basically what we're doing for the next 5 to 6 weeks. All right, Samuel, Chronicles and Psalms. Samuel, Chronicles and Psalms. That's what we're doing as we focus on the life and times of King David, a very significant figure in the Bible story. Okay, so what I want to do in this tutorial is just introduce you to the Book of Chronicles, the second part of our readings, and say something about the Book of Psalms, although I have much more to say about that, I think, next week. Probably dig into that a little bit deeper. So let's have a look at the Book of Chronicles, all right? Basically, the narrative of Chronicles very much repeats or mirrors what we are reading in 2 Samuel. That's why we're reading them at the same time and all essentially focused on David. But much in the same way that the Book of Deuteronomy, if you take your mind a few weeks back, remember when Deuteronomy repeated the stories of Exodus and Numbers, but it did so well after the fact, and so it had quite a bit of a different tone to it? That's very much what the Book of Chronicles does, okay? The chronicler, the author of Chronicles, different to the person who wrote Samuel, the author of Chronicles is looking back from about 500 or 600 years after the fact. Like they're way into our future, okay, where we're currently at in the story, and they're looking way back to the David era. And so as the chronicler writes, chronicles this part of Israel's history, David's history, it has a very different feel to us. And this is very clear as you read the first 9 chapters of the genealogies this week. What you'll notice is that he traces back the genealogy all the way back from Adam through to Noah and Abraham and Moses, all that genealogy as you'd expect. But he takes Israel's history all the way through to Nehemiah, okay, which is, we're not even anywhere near Nehemiah yet, but that's where the chronicler is, and when he is writing, he's way over there, about 400 BC, all right, so we've jumped right ahead as he's looking way back, all right, so just to help you with some broad figures, okay, imagine Abraham back in Genesis, around about 2000 BC, in very rough figures, okay? 2000 BC. Moses and Joshua, about 1400, okay? The whole Exodus story, so that's a 600 year gap between Abraham and Moses and Joshua, 1400. David and Saul, where we're at now, is about 1000 BC, that's where we're at now, whereas Ezra and Nehemiah about 400 BC, another 500 to 600 year gap, okay? So Chronicles is written way over here, 400 BC. It's one of the reasons that in the Jewish Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Chronicles is their very last book. Okay, the Hebrew Bible finishes with Chronicles because it's the last thing before Jesus comes, okay, in the 1st century. And just like Samuel, incidentally, the Book of Chronicles is was originally one book. So why do I say all that? Well, the purpose of Chronicles, way over here, way in the future, in 400 BC, is to look back 600 years earlier to 1000 BC, look to the story of David, remember all the good bits about King David, because they're looking forward to a new David coming. By the time we come into the Gospels, into the era of Jesus, those people are looking forward to a new king like David. Not only are they looking forward to a new Moses, remember when Moses died, he said, another one like me will come. They're looking forward to a new Moses, but they're also looking forward to a new David. And so that is what the Book of Chronicles is all about. It's a different feel to Samuel. Samuel is very real and raw. It's like very much in the moment. This is what's currently happening. It's like the journalists of the day writing the story of Samuel. This is what it's like with David right now. The Book of Chronicles says the same stories, but with a very different feel. It's looking back at David and how awesome David was and the good old days of David, because won't it be great when the next David comes, basically, okay? So as we read Chronicles, it doesn't mention any of the negative side or the challenging side of David's life. It's basically all the good stuff. And it's not because Chronicles is sweeping all the bad stuff under the carpet. It's just that we already have that in the book of Samuel. His purpose is different. His purpose is to highlight the good of David as we look forward for a new David coming in the future. I hope that makes sense. All right. So basically, as we're reading Samuel, very real and raw feel to it. As we read Chronicles, it's a very good old days, looking back to the good old days, because the future is also going to be a great vibe. And then, of course, we come to the book of Psalms, which is the poetry and the songs written around this period of time. Well, kinda. Yes and no, okay? It's a bit hard to date the Psalms sometimes. Basically, this week we're reading 25 Psalms, some of which are attributed to David. As I mentioned last week, about half of the Psalms are written by David, but many of the Psalms we're going to be reading this week are attributed to some people called the sons of Korah, okay? Now, you might remember Korah's name. He was basically a Levite who rebelled against Moses, okay, in the book of Numbers, and he's the guy that the ground swallowed alive, okay? He had that great rebellion and God swallowed him alive. Well, not all of his descendants died. Some of the sons of Korah lived on, and so these people writing these Psalms in David's day are basically his descendants. And there's three of them that are named, these sons of Korah. One's called Heman, okay? And we're going to read one of his Psalms, Psalms 88 this week. One's called Ethan, or sometimes Jeduthun, and he wrote Psalm 89. We're going to read that again next week, And then another son of the sons of Korah is Asaph, and you're going to see his name over and over again. He's responsible for around about a dozen of the Psalms. So you'll see their names, at least if you're reading a paper Bible. Those of you who are doing audio Bible, I don't know whether your audio book mentions the introduction to the Psalms, about what kind of music it's played to and who the author is, but certainly in a paper Bible or an electronic Bible, you should have that in written form. And those three men, the sons of Asaph, are all listed together, as you'd expect, in the genealogy in Chronicles. You'll see that there in chapter 6 this week. All right, so as I mentioned, I'll have more to say about the Psalms in next week's tutorial, because we're going to be camped here for quite a while. But until then, what you'll very soon discover this week, and if you haven't already from last week, is that there is far more to Psalms than simply songs of worship or praise. All right, the Psalms contain personal reflections, lament, cries of despair. There's a lot of expressions of emotion from these men of God, all right? They include encouragements and exhortations, rebukes and instructions. They contain godly advice. You'll see that this week. The Psalms contain theological insights. And we need to be careful just how many theological conclusions we draw from the Psalms, but they certainly provide theological insights. One of the things I noticed this week in a number, and keep this in mind as you read, is that these Psalms this week provide a number of insights into the afterlife, okay, into the idea of the Jewish people at this time in history as to what the afterlife was like. What happens to people when they die? Well, pay attention to that, because you'll see some of that come up this week. The Psalms contain prophetic elements pointing towards the future. You'll see some of that this week. You're going to read a number of passages you're like, that sounds really familiar to me. I swear I've read that in the New Testament. Yes, you have. Many Psalms are quoted in the New Testament. You're going to come across those this week, because the Psalms contain prophetic elements pointing to the future. But they also contain a lot of historical elements. There's a number of Psalms that recall the past, and you'll come across some of those this week. Some of them, as they recall the past, they're very plain. It just talks about the Red Sea crossing and the way that God's people whinged in the desert under Moses. Okay, they record history in a very plain way. And sometimes the Psalms, because Psalms are songs, they're poetry, right? They record history in a very poetic way, in a very exaggerated way, in a very creative way. Last week in Psalm 18, we read about how God parted the Red Sea by blasting his nostrils, okay? And you think, well, no, I remember the Exodus story. That wasn't in the Exodus story. No, it wasn't, okay? This is dramatic language, creative language. I actually use that psalm as an illustration in my book, talking about how the Bible uses non-literal language to talk about events, and that's just the way we're supposed to read it, okay? Get used to poetic language, and of course, this was all modeled for us in the very first psalm in the Bible, okay? Sung by Moses and Miriam when they came out of the Red Sea. And you might go back and watch tutorial week number 5 where I spoke about this, where Moses sets the pattern for the future psalms of God's people. Some of them are very literal, some of them are very poetic and exaggerated, some of them look back to the past, some of them look back to the future. Well, Moses' very first psalm there in Exodus 15 does all that, and we see that over and over again as we work our way through the book of Psalms. A last thing about Psalms for this week is that, just a bit of a heads up, it is very difficult, as I suggested before, to pinpoint when certain Psalms were written. And you probably even noticed that last week. A number of the Psalms we read are definitely out of whack with the chronology. They were not written at this time in history. A number of the Psalms we've read, and this week as well, will speak about going up to Jerusalem and going up to Zion. And we're like, well, hang on, Jerusalem isn't part of the David story yet. We haven't come across Jerusalem yet. So this is a very difficult thing when it comes to pointing the chronology of the Psalms. And so what we've done is we've put Psalms in areas where they accompany the reading. So sort of what we're reading in the narrative, the crying out to God for help and God delivering, where we're putting some of those Psalms in this place. So all I'm saying is, don't think too much about the Psalms from a chronological point of view, okay? Just think of them as accompanying the readings, and I guess benefiting you this week, because at the end of the day, this week particularly, we're not reading much narrative at all. 3 chapters in Samuel, a bunch of genealogies and chronicles that you're probably going to skip over quite quickly. Most of your time is going to be spent in the book of Psalms, so don't overthink the chronology. Just enjoy them and allow God to minister to you as you read. Always important to do that. Okay, so as I said right at the start of this challenge, we are doing a chronological reading through the Bible, more or less, okay? We're doing it as best we can. We're trying to balance out this thing of understanding the big picture of the narrative of the scripture from Genesis all the way through, okay? We're trying to understand the big picture of chronology, but we're also balancing out reading big portions of scripture and books as they were written at the same time, so we're not chopping and changing everywhere between book and book. I mean, I think we're already doing enough of that this week with just the 3 books, Samuel, Chronicles, and Psalms. To do that all over the show just to get a pinpointed chronology is just way too difficult, okay? So I hope you hear that. Chronology, more or less. Don't think too much about that when you read the Psalms. All right, there you go. So 25 Psalms this week. The first 10 chapters of Chronicles, and 2 Samuel 2, 3, and 4, where the conflict between not Saul and David, because Saul's dead, but the house of Saul, or the followers of Saul, and the house of David begins. And just like we saw the slow demise of Saul as an individual with David rising, so we're going to start seeing in the narrative here the slow demise of those who follow Saul as the house of David rises, first leading just in Judah and ultimately over the whole of Israel as his kingdom expands. Enjoy this week's readings, guys, and I'll catch you next week. I look forward to it.